welcome to Ask After Dark. We are here, hopefully, with Leah Bobet. We are, of course, experiencing technical difficulties, as we tend to do. On the show, it feels like. But what can work, so hopefully Leah will get back and we will be able to get back into the swing of things. I know we are a few viewers in. We've got Thomas. Hello, Thomas. And Elon. Hello, both of you guys. This will be the last show of the year, which is a little. I feel like, well, the year has gone by, and it is as long as we can get all the technical issues, it should be a fantastic show. Leah is one of friends of mine that I know both from general Toronto world and also from the sort of literary world. Okay, let's see if she's here. Hello, Leah.
All right, hello.
There we go. I was doing the general introduction.
All right, got it working again.
Welcome to Ask Lovecraft After Dark. As I was telling the folks just now, you're one of the folks who I know from two different Venn diagrams of my social world. I know you through sort of general Toronto geek, gamer, just sort of that sphere. But then we also got to know each other online because we all had the same sort of writer and artist friends, and we're talking about weird fiction. So it made sense to bring these two worlds crashing into one another for the final Ask Lovecraft After Dark. So welcome and thank you for being on.
Thank you very much for having me.
Leah is the author of two novels, Above and Inheritance of Ashes, and has a story that is out in the just came out this week. Am I right? The collection of Nowhereville?
Yes, it was yesterday or today was the release day.
There we go. So the brand new Nowhereville collection, which I got a chance to get a peek at, and it was a lot of fun. So we're going to be talking about that and talking about some of her work as an editor and as a reviewer. But I want to jump right into Nowhereville. I really had no idea what to expect when I started, dipping in. Even reading the intro started with a lesson about what is weird fiction and where does it sit between fantasy and sci-fi. And I went, oh, okay, I'm holding onto my chair because this is going to be intense. And then it became this interesting sort of meditation on notions of place and notions of timing. And I was still sort of, where is this going? And very quickly it became clear that this was looking at weirdness and this sort of, I don't even know if urban settings, but also there was something very naturalistic, and yet in that naturalism, the weirdness began to kind of bleed through. And your story was a good example of that. Over under, it was, as I flipped sort of straight to it and started reading it, and it was like seeing things on the periphery of my vision start to kind of creep in, rather than just opening up and a tentacle splatting on my face. So tell us about how you got involved with this project and where Over Under came from.
Okay, well, initially, and I mean, this project has been in the works for a while. I think it was 2.5 years ago, at least, that the editor, Scott Gable, the two editors, Scott Gable and C. Dombrowski, and Scott reached out and solicited a story. And it was kind of a nice feeling because I'd been kind of in the novel end of things for a while. I started in short fiction and had 10 years of short fiction under my belt, but once you get into novels, sometimes the time for that just bleeds away very rapidly, and which is a shame because it's really fun as a form. So I was like, oh good, here's a deadline. Yes. So Over Under at the time, it's very interesting to be asked to do a story that is about cities and the oddness of cities when you are so involved with your own city in certain ways. I mean, I have urbanist on my bio on Twitter. That's maybe a slight bit of pretension, like just a tiny bit. But it's, once you kind of get into how cities work and just the multivariate sort of experiences, and like a city that's changing so much. Toronto has changed hugely in the last 10 years. It's very difficult to figure out what you want to say about it. And I struggled with that story a lot, actually. I think I tried on 5 different concepts before I landed on what I actually did. but at the time there was a significant discussion around harm reduction. It is kind of a harm reduction story. Your protagonists there are harm reduction workers. Um, and there is a supervised injection site not far from my place now, actually, and there was a whole discussion going on about that at the time. So it was coming from simultaneously wanting to talk about the way all the narratives about Toronto are starting to press against each other in these little tectonic layers and creating tiny earthquakes. The experience of living in the city is starting to create little tiny earthquakes. But also, it's really fun to make the Chameleon Monument and like the Descent of Inanna just fight. um, because they're, again, I guess that's the other side of it. You've got these two very different narratives of how you move in the world. There's these two narratives of how you be a protagonist and what it costs and what being at the center of a story means. And it was kind of the right headspace at the time, which I think was, God, it might have been 2017, to throw those two things in a blender and see who came out on top. And kind of, I think, part of the point is that neither of them really come out on top. It's just they're not connecting worldviews, which I hope is what got across. But eventually that is what landed on after kind of thinking, if I have to say something definitive about a city that I love very much and it's feeling very fractured right now, what even do I say? So that's kind of where the whole thing came from.
Was the decision to do it partially in second person an attempt to kind of immediately draw people into that city and draw people into that role, or where did that kind of impulse come from?
Oh, it is second person, isn't it? Um, it's there is a thing. I know second person is one of those stylistic choices that a lot of people have very strong reactions to. And I've always loved it, but only for certain stories, and it's usually because it is incredibly intimate and yet almost repels. So it's that pull push that you get, and especially for something that is weird fiction, it's a really useful tool in the toolbox because, I mean, that it's that sense of that very Junji Ito, like, this is my hole, it was made for me, like attract, repel. It just seems, sometimes I will fall into second person, I think, when it just feels like a story that needs that kind of intimacy. And it needed that kind of intimacy.
Well, it definitely had the intimacy. Well, and the subject matter, right? We're dealing with issues of addiction, which in urban settings are huge, although also even in rural settings, right? I mean, I'm here in Ohio, which is battling its own sort of narratives surrounding addiction and surrounding how we talk about addiction and how do we talk about it, as you said, sort of tectonically, running up against issues of race, I mean, running up against issues of class. It was really fun. It was really interesting to kind of be looking at such a Toronto specific story after having been there for so long, but then after having been away from there and kind of this weird palimpsest of my experiences, kind of changing how, it would be very different if I were reading it in, while still living either down, in the annex, or, off of Bloor, any of the places where we wound up, we're living, it's a very different story than now being so removed. So, I think it definitely worked very well within the theme of the sort of the urban exploration, the urbanist weird fiction, if you will. And writing for as you said, the monomyth and playing with the monomyth is something that you've done before. I know when you've talked about your novel Inheritance of Ashes, you talked about very consciously wanting to play with this idea of the farm boy who goes off and becomes a hero. Well, what if that's reversed? What happens when you have the hero who then settles down on a farm? I think you also said you were inspired a great deal by NPC design.
Yes. It's like, what's going on? What is the subjectivity of the non-player characters? What are they thinking about here? Yeah.
So tell me about that. Tell me, are you know, is I know Camp. I know people. I feel like right now we're in the vogue of kind of trashing on Campbell. But what's your take on the Monomyth and Campbell and all that Bill Moyersy interview goodness?
Oh dear, it is. I have really mixed feelings about the whole Campbellian monomyth because it feels kind of like story is a very organic thing because story comes out of people and people are complicated and organic. And I'm not grounded in the history in this, so I might just be talking out my ear here. But I feel like the whole Campbellian monomyth is very much this urge to systematize something that is not systematizable. There's this feeling, there's this flavor of a 1930s urge to order that just permeates that whole thing for me. It's like we are living in an organized world, damn it. Or, no supper. And it is the way it's broken down into such micro stages, the way it's grained so finely that it's like, okay, this is one experience. This is a small handful of books. It's a very narrow lens, and the fact that it has to discriminate finer and finer and finer, like where there's a bit where you have to refuse the call in certain ways, like although that was really funny to make, not being able to get on the Queen streetcar because all my heroism is thwarted by not ever being able to get on the Queen streetcar.
The very specific, questions about where on the streetcar you are, and like, no, I'm not on the steps. I'm off the steps. I'm good.
Yes,
I've played these games.
Yeah.
I'm over the yellow line. Just my foot is.
Yep. It's that it's funny because, like, I know you mentioned we don't necessarily have to talk about the Lovecraft thing per se, but I get the same feeling from the Campbellian monomyth that I do get from reading Howard Phillips Lovecraft, which is someone who feels like they are in a universe that is intensely out of their control, who is very frightened by the absolute lack of control they feel they have over their life, trying to narrativize or exercise some sense of control so they can continue breathing. It feels like coping rather than a format that is meant to prescribe, or something that you're meant to use to create. It feels more diagnostic than anything else. And so it's the kind of thing I do like to pick at and I do like to play with because I am intensely interested in other kinds of heroisms, in little heroisms, in what it means to not go out, make the grand gesture, have the major quest, but keep the farm running. Like, that's a little heroism. What it means to go for 2 years quietly and knock doors for a candidate and not, you have not created a grand gesture, but we have these very specific narratives of impact and these very specific narratives of change that get sort of put forward if you decide that Campbell's formula is the only way you want to quantify heroism. And it leaves a lot of stuff out. So I'm frequently very interested in going into the sides and finding all the stuff that doesn't get touched by it.
And this novel was written as a young adult novel, which contrasts with your first novel, which didn't start off as YA, but wound up there. So tell us about that particular hero's journey.
Okay, so Above was written as a literary fantasy novel. Like, I had that geared as an adult novel that just happened to have a younger protagonist. The protagonist of Above, Matthew, is 17, kind of going on 35, and emotionally going on 12. He grew up in an underground community that's kind of that Ron Perlman Beauty and the Beast. We live in the sewers because we were cast out of society, and we have very good libraries, and all our clothes are clean, and no one has scurvy. Do not ask questions.
We get vitamin D somehow.
Yes, somehow we have, like, important, sunlight. We have sun lamps. There's just, like, SAD lamps everywhere. And some of it, you could tell what I was picking at a bit with that. But he is the historian. He's the oral historian of this community. And a lot of it is the process of finding out, after a little bit of a cataclysm, that how many of the stories that he is responsible for keeping and repeating or edited a bit to make certain people look good, and then what are you going to do about that? I did not think this was a YA novel. I thought I was writing a fictional Truth and Reconciliation Commission. um, but
Okay, very
when
Canadian.
I
So yes, well done.
It is. It has committee meetings too. It's the most Canadian thing. Um,
How often do people have to
they
queue up?
Not too much queuing.
Okay, well,
Possibly some Tim Hortons,
okay, all right.
but definitely committees. And a lot of that, when I got representation for that book, my agent at the time wanted to send it both adult and YA. It was a split submission strategy. And interestingly, we got similar interests and similar spectrums of interest from both sides, but a lot of my entree as a YA novelist after 10 years of adult short fiction was the fact that the probably stablest and best offer we got on the book was from Scholastic, and it was specifically Arthur A. Levine Books, which a particular imprint of Scholastic. And having, taken that contract and worked with Scholastic on the first book, the contract had an option novel in it, which meant that I then had to learn how to write a YA novel on purpose, which was a whole different set of challenges.
Well,
do it again.
You talked about going into the YA community as essentially having to start at a new high school. Is that a complimentary thing to say?
I did say that, didn't I?
Because that sounds like terror to me. The idea of like having to change high schools, sort of, midway through.
See, you have to understand. When I went to high school, I was coming out of a very small private school where I'd known the same 50 kids since I was 4 years old.
That's the high school I went to. So
yeah, when I went to high school, all of a sudden there were 300 kids. It was freedom, but it was interesting. There's different parts of the industry have simultaneously different professional norms, different ways of getting things done, but also different social norms. And I was pretty well solid in adult genre fiction. I knew how things worked, and I had a great deal of experience, and had people with whom I was friendly with, and people with whom I was actually friends, and that was fine. And then I had to go learn YA sort of by hand, and that was a very interesting experience because it was the first time that I had to look at everything I knew about publishing and go, okay, what is just, what is how we behave and what is just this neighborhood? And what do I like about these particular different neighborhoods? What are different neighborhoods doing maybe more interestingly, or ways that fit me better than others? And when you start comparing how different genres do things, you start getting a better sense of how the whole squirming system works. So that was super interesting.
I like this neighborly
actually a
approach.
lot
It
of
feels
fun.
like the Jane Jacobs approach to literary theory. So
It really is. It's like they're like sub-communities. It's communities of practice, I guess, would be the very urbanist way to say it. We're all kind of living in the same general space, but we've just got slightly different ways of doing things in that town.
you talked about how the act of reading was social, and the sort of with the YA world and with sort of the younger writing world, and that how that was a bit of an education.
Yes. So Above published in 2012. So we're in a particular time and place vis-a-vis the whole YA boom and basically all the money from Harry Potter, Twilight, and Hunger Games still sort of floating through the system.
Well, that was when I was working in the bookstore. I mean, I could literally remember a point when suddenly every new YA novel had the Twilight clone covers on them. You'd have one object with like a bit of red, and then that got sort of duplicated again with the 50 Shades books. When suddenly everything had to imitate the 50 Shades covers.
There was a bit where it was like girls, but like their backs. There was like 6 months of like backless dresses going on.
I feel like that was sort of the urban fantasy. There was some sort of urban fantasy movement, where it was all these like weird like backless dresses and slightly askance,
Yeah, the kind of poses. It was, but all that I actually did like those Twilight covers. I didn't mind that cover trend because they were very elegant. It's very much like British hard science fiction. Um, but this was in that time where you have an intense amount of blockbuster money floating through YA, which means all the editors get to take a chance on weird mid-list books. This guy, um, and a lot of kind of different parlance coming in. I'm so sorry, I forgot what the actual question was. We totally got sidetracked.
Oh, just what it was like this idea of acting of reading being social and the kind of the communal relationship of writing and reading that I think I think we may have frozen. So I will wait and see if we can get Leah back. But yeah, this is in previous writings that Leah has done. She's talked about this notion that suddenly she was expected to be much more involved in kind of the community. Was receiving these. I loved how she put it. 15-year-old girls would send her interviews. Questions like these big, massive sort of bullet points of answer these 23 questions, and just the courage that takes to be. I was talking about how you mentioned being sent these lists of questions from 15-year-old readers, just massive lists of questions that expecting you to answer for their blogs, and the sort of the courage that would take. I would pester Bruce Campbell occasionally, via emails, but that was sort of it as far as my teenage self.
Oh, okay, so there's the general reader engagement.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was interesting because you're very aware, I think, that you're talking to younger people. And you want to be honest in ways that, like, you want to represent things truthfully. But also there's such thing as boundaries. And, you don't necessarily want to be like, so teenagers, let me spill my messes all over you. That's rude. It definitely made me think about. I was told by a more experienced author early on that one had to, when publishing a novel space, decide on your public persona. You had to decide who you wanted to be. And I think at the time I had a slightly negative reaction to that because I was like, I want to be myself. And she was like, no, you will choose. You'll see. But that made me very aware of, where that perspective was coming from. It's, okay, what do you want to bring into the author world? What do you want to be willing to talk about as an author? What do you want to keep personal and keep as the personal world? And it is very much more intense in YA. You had the book blogging culture. I don't know how weird book blogging culture is now. I feel like that was, oh, there we go. That's where we were. Harry Potter space. Social reading is a social thing. It was that is a space where the experience of reading was so little about sitting in the corner of the library by yourself, which is my experience of being a young reader. And so much about reading books so you could talk to them about them with your friends. It was reading books so you could connect with people over them. It's books as social glue, and the expectation of connection that the authors as well would participate in was different. It's a really cool kind of reading culture. I think it's a very Victorian Edwardian reading culture as well. Like, this is not the first time this thing has happened. But yeah, it does ask different things, and I had to learn how to move in slightly different ways to accommodate that and fill that role, and simultaneously also not be a version of myself that I did not want to be because of it. So that was an interesting navigation. It's like you're moving to a new town. You learn how the new town works.
And how have you navigated going from being a writer to being an editor and back and forth? Because I know you've been involved with a lot of big online projects. Idiomancer was one. Yeah, you were part of the Abyss site for a while. Tell us about kind of moving between those different roles.
That's not been, or at least that seems to have come rather naturally, because I started editing pretty young. I think I was 19 or 20 when we started up Abyss and Apex, and then moved to Idiomancer. God, I was probably 22, tops. So this was all happening at the same time. Um, they were parallel streams, and I also came out of workshop culture. Like I got started on the online writing workshop for science fiction, fantasy, and horror, which at the time was a Del Rey online writing workshop. It was founded by a former Del Rey editor. And so that sort of interplay of writing and reading and critiquing and suggesting has always kind of been part of my process. It is functionally just pulling apart the workshop functions, except with, when you're an editor, you're doing it with a budget. And you have to walk slightly more carefully and be very kind about how you say your things because you're carrying some definitely unearned and fictitious power in terms of where your budget's coming from. Like it's nothing. It really isn't anything. But people in your slush pile feel it's something. So you've got to be mindful of how you move. But they've always been very interlaced parts of my process. The sort of rule of thumb of my workshop was that you learn more by critiquing than being critiqued because it's about learning how to spot systems and function and craft by looking at other people's work, which you're not like as inside attached to, and then you can take that understanding and apply it to your own. So those have always been a bit of like the water cycle for me. Editing begets writing, begets editing, begets writing.
And a final permutation I kind of want to ask about, just because it's the first I've seen. You had a work of yours turned into a choral piece, Wings of Our Children.
Oh, yeah.
Tell
Yeah,
us
that was fun.
how that came about.
Again, it's like sometimes things happen because people just email me. The composer, Timothy Tkach, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, I'm sorry, Tim, does a lot of choral work around upper middle United States, I think, generally, and tends to look for texts to adapt, and came across the story it's adapted from, Displaced Persons, which was in Strange Horizons, oh man, probably 2004. So it's a Wizard of Oz story. It's basically from the Flying Monkeys' perspective. What happens after the regime change to the Flying Monkeys? It's not honestly a very polished story. I was 22, but it caught his attention. It was like, okay, would you be willing to let me, kind of put this in my bag for a future piece? And I was like, yeah, cool. I was a choir kid. This is pretty cool. That's a yes. And the piece did eventually get made. It was really fun, sort of. It was a commission for, I think, the Cor Cantiamo Choir. I cannot remember where they were based out of, but as they were workshopping and rehearsing it, occasionally I would get these little videos of them in rehearsal, and that was the neatest thing. So it's a fun little footnote. It is always really cool to watch art make more art, if that makes sense. I know I started as a musician. I am a failed musician, so I am a failed soprano. So, did that just crash?
Nope. You're still a soprano.
No, still going? Okay. All right, cool. I'm still a failed soprano. So I draw a lot of inspiration from music myself, and so getting to watch art make more art kind of on my end was very fun. So it is a tiny thing that was great. It meant I signed up for SOCAN and get issued occasionally, like, score royalty reports, but otherwise, yes.
Fantastic. Well, Nowhereville, we know, is just out. This is Nowhereville Weird is Other People from Broken Eye Books. And what else can we look forward to coming out in the next little while? Oh no, we can look forward to Leah finding a way to pop back on. I will let folks know that you can find a ton of her work on Amazon, of course, and she has her own website, leahbobet.com. Which you can visit, and it's chock full of information about her books, about her work, and that, of course, is always very helpful. I think we have her back. There we go. I'm doing the plugging of various social media sites. Letting folks know where they can find you at leahbobet.com. Where else can they look for you, and what else can they be looking forward to?
Twitter is a good place generally. So at leahbobet.com, I do a lot of talking about writing process. I will occasionally talk about reviews process. I do work as a trade reviewer right now. I also do like a lot of fine art shit posting. So if you're interested in shit posting about the art world, or critiquing like the LCBO Food and Drink magazine as an indicator of like Ontario's class anxiety, this particular is, uh,
There's a lot that can be said about Ontario's class anxiety.
you could write a book. Um, so there's a lot of, I mean, there's some professional stuff on the Twitter. There's some goofing around stuff upcoming. I know I've got some poetry coming out in January, so there's going to be a poem in Reckoning 4, which is going to be great. That's a eco-justice journal edited by Mike DeLuca, who is a wonderful editor. I'm going to have a poem in Uncanny magazine in January, February, which is kind of an elegy for Gene Wolfe and Madeline L'Engle and all the writers who were big when you were small. I've got a story upcoming in Strange Horizons right now. That's going to be first 4 months of the year, I think. We haven't scheduled that yet, but probably spring. So occasionally off stuff will blip across the Twitter between the fine art shit posting. We're watching a lot of Fake and Fortune right now. It's like I have opinions. Um, but so there's a lot of short work kind of up right now, and there's occasional process posts about the long form work, which is coming speedily to a conclusion. But yes, and then a lot of goofing around.
Wonderful. Well, keep an eye out for all the work coming out. Be sure to check out Nowhereville. Oh, one thing that's really fun about Nowhereville is all the like sort of abstracted maps in it. I think it looks like they're all done by this artist, this Russian artist that I've been following for a while now. Like he creates these beautiful abstract cityscapes, and he actually has like a Twitter account which just like I think uses bots to create these randomized cityscapes that I keep because I'm a D&D nerd and like looking at cities. They're beautiful. It's a really subtle and nice way of breaking up the chapters and giving you that sense of this imagined space. So do be sure to check it out.
Mm-hmm.
This has been Ask Lovecraft After Dark. I want to thank Leah for coming on. I want to thank everyone for watching. We've been having some nice little chats happening on the sidebar here, and we always appreciate having y'all. If you are interested in this show, you can go to asklovecraft.com, where you'll find both it and the main program, Ask Lovecraft, where I, for reasons unknown to anyone, including myself, pretend to be H.P. Lovecraft and answer your questions. If you would like to be part of these live shows, you can go to Facebook and join the Ask Lovecraft Appreciation Society, where we are very tasteful and very discreet and have ourselves a wonderful old time. You could follow me on Twitter if you just want to. I don't do anything as classy as talk about the art world. I just scream into the empty void, as everyone knows. That's at Lehman Kessler.
Oh, it's not classy.
If you can find out about upcoming live shows, I believe the next thing slated is going to be my impersonating Peter Lorre at a local Chautauqua here in Ohio. So if you want to see me do my best Peter Lorre impression and perhaps learn anything about Peter Lorre, come out to that. That'll be in the spring. But you can find out about that and other live shows at lehmankessler.com. And if you really enjoy this program, if it speaks to you in a way that tugs not only at your heart but at your purse strings, you can go to patreon.com/asklovecraft and help keep the lights on here at Ask Lovecraft Studios. Regardless, I want to thank absolutely every single person for watching. Again, Leah, thank you so much for coming on the show. We're excited to see what comes next from you.
Thank you very much for having me again.
All right, everyone. Bye.